Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the legality of pot cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That's this guy's relatives, basically. All the most recent pot cards like Pot of Prosperity, Pot of Extravagance, and Pot of Desires, and how the different formats have chosen to balance them and ban or limit or whatever them, and just what it all means for Yu-Gi-Oh! And of course, I want to hear you guys' opinions on it as well. The reason why I've been thinking about this is because in Master Duel's most recent ban list, they put Pot of Extravagance to 1. And that joins Pot of Prosperity, which is also already at 1. And then I thought about how in the TCG, Pot of Desires is at 2. And there's just a lot to say about it. When you think about the pot cards themselves, here, we'll switch over to this so you guys can kind of see all the different ones that we're going to talk about. Yeah, when you think about the pot cards themselves, they all stem from Pot of Greed, right? Hi. And its ability to draw 2 cards. So obviously this card's broken and busted, and unfortunately just can never really come back to Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a play and profit card, and advantage means everything in this game. So they've made these different spin-off cards. And early on, the spin-off cards were either just really awful, weird things like these, or the first probably decent one was like Pot of Avarice, where you targeted 5 monsters in your grave, shuffled them into the deck, and then drew 2 cards. So this wasn't as good as Pot of Greed, obviously, because you had to do a bit of setup. In older Yu-Gi-Oh, getting 5 cards in the graveyard like quickly, like on like say turn 1, was basically impossible. As time passed, that became easier and easier, and eventually Pot of Avarice did see its way onto the ban list. It's actually been banned for a while, and it kind of came back a few years back, and has not really made a huge impact. Mostly just because a lot of combo decks really don't need to recycle their cards. When you think of things like, wind-ups or Plant Synchro or decks like that, they made a lot of use of Pot of Avarice because even though games had like explosive combos, they were still typically pretty grindy, and so being able to sort of reset things made this card valuable. In today's landscape, not so good. The best deck to really make use of it was like the Zodiac Tri-Brigade deck. I kind of remember that using Pot of Avarice pretty well just because like Zodiacs could, recycle their cards, but it has since kind of fallen off. There's also Pot of Duality, so this is the first of the interesting kind of Master Duel hits. In the TCG and OCG, this card is at 3, but Master Duel chose to hit it to 2. And I guess it's just because consistency is a pretty big thing. Some say this is a hit to Fluanderies, or just stun decks in general. And yeah, Extravagance excavates the top 3, adds 1 to your hand, and you can't special summon after that. For that reason, I think that Pot of Duality is generally a pretty fair card. It's only actually getting you 1 card, not like drawing you 2. And because you can't special summon after it, which is pretty much the thing that modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Sort of predicated on, is like spamming special summons, I think that Duality generally just never feels like it's going to be very game-breaking. The best you can say about it is that it's going to be useful in like some really dedicated stun strategies. You think of like your Fossil Dyna Inspector border sort of things, and just other slower sort of stun decks, like a Guru Control type of deck, might get really good use out of Duality. But then we get into our sort of faster, more modern cards. The first being Pot of Desires. So this one, I remember when it came out, was extremely controversial. Like, some people thought that this card sucked and was terrible. Other people were like, yeah, it's pretty good. So it's banish 10 cards from the top of your deck face down, draw 2 cards. So this was the first time that Konami really started introducing these heavy, deep kind of like costs to activating these cards. Banishing 10 cards from the top of your deck face down is like a really, really, really big thing. I mean, if you think about like what you're losing in terms of like engines and cards for later, you can see why a lot of people did not feel this was a very good card. Now, I've never really agreed that it's like a neg 9, as some people like to say, because those are cards that you might never have really even seen throughout the course of the duel, and that's not really how card economy works in the first place. But that's besides the point. The point is, this was a card that let you draw 2, and so the raw advantage gained here, plus the fact that there were no sort of strings attached outside of that, like, besides the hard once return, you could still search stuff or draw things later. You don't have to use it at the start of the main phase 1, which is like kind of how Extravagance gets, and you can still special summon and stuff, meant that this was actually a pretty good card. Now, what I've always been kind of fascinated by with Pot of Desires is the fact that while Master Duel chose to keep it at 3, where they've hit most of the other pots, as you can see, it has had to get hit in the TCG and the OCG to 2, and I think it's for a mix of reasons. The main thing is that with a lot of modern decks, you can kind of filter through the important cards in your engine and get them either in your hand, on the field, or in the graveyard, and then activate Pot of Desires at the very end of your turn. And by doing it this way, it makes it easier to draw, just like, say, the hand traps that you need for your opponent's turn, for like, stopping them, drawing your Ash Blossom. And that's why I think that it's kind of had to go to 2. There are also certain specific decks that were able to make pretty decent use of this, like I know Sword Soul kind of comes to mind because they've got the big like level 10 synchro that gains attack based on banished cards. Or the Grin Maju deck that could like, use Pot of Greed to just power up Grin Maju a lot. I don't think that those two specific decks are actually really why Pot of Desires got hit. I actually think it's just more about the first reason. But you can argue with me about that in the comments because there's plenty of, it's like not like we'll ever know why Konami does half the stuff they do. Pot of Desires, though, I think does strike a pretty good balance in terms of like what I would call risk and reward. Losing 10 cards is big. If you can time it to where it's later in your turn, that is mitigated, but it is still pretty big. And one of the things with Pot of Desires that always sucks, and it kind of applies to Extravagance as well, is when you use Pot of Desires and draw another copy of Pot of Desires, or God forbid, 2 other copies of Pot of Desires, back in the early days when it wasn't at 2 yet. That was always like just terrible. I've actually resolved Desires and drawn 2 Desires and just been like, oh my god, my life is ending. So, yeah, Pot of Desires, pretty good one. Pretty just, it's very hot and cold, so I think that it's fine and pretty balanced. So it doesn't really wonder why they put it to 2, and we'll never really know, but I think 2 is fine. Honestly, 2 kind of ended up being the number that most people seem like they were comfortable running anyway, so seems okay. Alright, next is Pot of Extravagance. Now this is an interesting one because Master Duel put this card to 2 a while back, and they recently just put it to 1, but the TCG and OCG both have it at 3. At the start of your main phase, you banish 3 or 6 random cards from your extra deck face down. Draw 1 card for every 3 cards banished, and for the rest of the turn after this card resolves, you can't draw any cards by card effects. So this is the way where you can tell they really started to get pretty like they're really fine-tuning exactly what you can and can't do and how to balance this card. So first of all, the big thing is you have to use this at the start of your main phase 1. That means that there is no, you can't really like do a bunch of searching, do a bunch of special summoning, use all the cards you want in your extra deck first, and then use Extravagance and just banish the last 6 that happen to be left. You have to start with Extravagance. So you have to start with that commitment of banishing random cards from your extra deck face down. And it also means that if this is going to get Ash Blossomed, it's going to get Ash Blossomed. There's only one time Extravagance can be used. It's at the start of the main phase. So there's not like a way to use something weaker to bait the Ash. You've got to use it here. You also could even extend that a bit further to something like Droll and Lockbird, where you have to kind of commit to a search card at the very start, or a draw card at the very start of your main phase, and if they're going to draw you, your whole main phase is locked. Not as maybe intense as the Ash example, but you get the picture. Anyway, so the fact that you banish 3 or 6 random cards face down from your extra deck is a pretty big deal too. So banishing from your main deck was always one of those things where like you could sort of write it off as a sunk cost thing, right? Like, oh, you were never going to see these cards anyway, so the fact that they're gone means they're just gone, whatever, we'll just play around it. But banishing from your extra deck is a pretty big deal because in the modern day, the extra deck is kind of its own toolbox, and it's actually assured that you can access things in your extra deck more so than like in your main deck. There's some cards in your main deck you just will never draw, but because the extra deck cards just come from nowhere, if you think about how like Link monsters and stuff or Xyz work, they're very easy to just make. It means that banishing copies of them face down really sucks. That relegates this card mostly to decks that don't need their extra deck heavily. That could be a, again, a stun style deck, or just decks that lightly go into the extra deck. Speaking from just Master Duel experience, obviously Floowandereeze try to use this card a lot as well, but Labyrinth is a pretty big example, and even some Kashtira decks will run this. So this card requires you to like not need your extra deck or run multiple copies of things in your extra deck, because like, oh, if I'm running 3 copies of this thing, then what are the chances all 3 will get banished? Sucks when they are, but I think that it's a pretty nice balancing mechanism, and they're face down, so you will not be getting access to them again, at least not normally, right? Okay, so you draw 1 card every 3 cards banished. This means that unlike Pot of Duality, this card can be a +1 in like raw card economy again. And then for the rest of the turn after this card resolves, you can't draw any cards by card effects. I think this was a clause strictly put in here for, like Exodia deep draw sort of strategies. So if you use this, you can't also use a bunch of other draw cards. Oh yeah, it's kind of funny. It shows like the deck that this is most commonly used in. Makonko is another really good example there. So I see why Pot of Extravagance has slowly but steadily maybe become a bit of an issue. I think it's just because stun strategies really care more for card, like just net card quantity over quality, which is going to be a bit of a thing that we talk about more with Pot of Prosperity, where if you're running a stun strategy, you typically just care more about having raw cards, right? If there are going to be a lot of trap cards that are heavily disruptive, then just seeing more of them is more important than like seeing any certain one. Particularly with things like floodgates, where the value of having almost any two floodgates next to each other, if you're playing like a floodgate-centric deck, is greater than the value of having one. So, yeah, and that example applies for a lot of different decks, but I think I see why Pot of Extravagance probably had to go to 2 and then to 1. Stun decks have gotten a lot more prevalent in Master Duel, though in the TCG it's not really the case. I think that stun decks have a lot more trouble. There are more ways to deal with them thanks to like the side deck, games 2 and 3, spell and trap removal. So yeah, Pot of Extravagance's place in the TCG and OCG seems to be perfectly fine, but Master Duel seems to not care for it. Maybe the best of one thing has something to do with that, I'm not sure. And the final card is Pot of Prosperity. So this one is the most recent one, and it's also the one that I've heard the most amount of complaints from kind of more competitive players, and I'm inclined to kind of agree, but let's talk about it. So banish 3 or 6 cards of your choice from the extra deck face down. So right off the bat, this is a little different than Extravagance, whereas Extravagance is random, and this lets you pick, which means that you can sort of get rid of just the things that you don't think that you'll really need. And then you excavate cards equal to the number of ones that you hit, and you pick one card from them to add to your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your deck. You put it on the bottom of your deck instead of the top of the deck because obviously, you know, if you were to be able to do any sort of like draw effect, which this normally doesn't allow you to do, but like just in case that were to ever happen, maybe if you wanted to combo this with like duality or something, you can't. But yeah, so that specific excavation is very important. The fact that you can excavate 6 cards means you're actually going much deeper in your deck than any other pot card does, while getting to pick exactly what you need. And in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, we know that for most combo decks or some mid-range decks, it is very important to see the one starter card you need, or the one kind of just key card, the out perhaps, that you need, as opposed to getting 2 raw cards. Because the easy example to make would be if you desperately need a kaiju to out this troublesome boss monster, and it's the 3rd card from the top of your deck, then Extravagance wouldn't get it for you, but this would. So even though this is only like a 0 in card economy, the fact that you're getting the one card you need means more. And so yeah, that's pretty much it for this card. It also does not let you draw cards by other effects, same as Extravagance. But unlike Extravagance, you can pick when you activate this, so that's always been kind of an interesting part to me. A lot of people I've heard really want this card to get limited or perhaps even banned. The OCG's chosen to put it to 1, Master Duel's put it to 1, the TTG's got it at 3, but I would not be surprised to see that follow suit at some point soon. I know they've still got to get these reprint money from a Rarity Collection, but yeah, Prosperity I think is overall the best modern pot card. It edges out Extravagance and Desires to me a bit because this Prosperity, getting to pick that card I think is everything. So I would not be surprised to see it follow suit. And now that brings me to the overall conversation of where do the pot cards lie in Yu-Gi-Oh? Like, I want to know what people actually think about these things. Because, like, as a player, I don't have much of a problem with any of the pot cards. I would actually argue my least favorite ones are probably Extravagance, just because, but that might be because I don't really like maybe stunny, floodgatey decks being able to get so much raw advantage. But generally, I don't mind them. I think that every deck should have access to pot cards, and I like that there is a pot card for pretty much every type of strategy. They all have some risks associated with them, so they're not all playing profit. And I like that, you know, a stun deck can use its Extravagance, or maybe it's Duality. A combo deck might want to use Desires, might not, but definitely would want to use Prosperity. This is like, there's kind of a pot for everybody. Everybody gets to have some. But I do see where in the modern game, with cards, just individual cards themselves being much stronger and more impactful, you know, we have these jokes like draw the out because the outs typically are very strong, or because combos can start with one card. I think the ability to see any particular amount of cards from your deck, it has become slowly but steadily more and more of a thing that Konami probably feels they need to rein in. But yeah, I'd like to hear what you guys think about the pot cards, where you land on them. How do you feel about this guy? I would love to know. Let me know down in the comments. And again, happy Halloween, and check out the Halloween live stream that I'm planning on having tonight, assuming that everything goes well. All right. Anyways, it's going to be it. Bye, guys. Subscribe.